Hey, good evening. Welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. I'm actually waiting for dinner now. We always eat rather late. We eat down at Nanai's as a family, which I really enjoy. So quite possibly Talik Lake will be there. And it depends. If they've been shopping down at Lena's, they'll have some a new box of groceries to open up, and she might eat down there. But as a princess, she most often eats at Nanai's. And we have two beautiful baby, so we have the two children with us. We have Vek Vek, who helps Nanai, and Nanai of course, and Beck and I. And that's our little family get together at dinner, which I always enjoy. So I'm waiting for that now, and I will be called in maybe 15 minutes, which will give me time to do a video. And I was thinking back, because I've been recently to a funeral for our friend Urbano, the blind man, and it saddened me greatly, because we've been supporting him for quite a time now, which involved being involved with him and seeing him and seeing how grateful he always was for everything that we did for him. Small though it was, we supported him with his basic groceries per month, and he always had a smile. We first met him when he was in very poor shape, because the house that he was living in was like a chicken hut, but that's on another video anyway, and already covered. So I was in a kind of a melancholy mood on that, and then a couple of subscribers said, why don't you do some of the late night meanderings, which is where I talk about nothing more than those things which are on my mind. Made me realise, whether you know it or not, I'm quite an old fart. I was born in 1939, which a friend of mine used to say, oh, you were born in 1900 and frozen to death, yeah, which was fair enough. So I was born just before the outbreak, July, just before the outbreak of the Second World War. And when that really began to happen, life really changed for me. I don't have a great awareness of the chronology of things, like this happened, then this happened, because I was a kid. But I have milestone memories which remind me of what life was like back then. We lived in a very poor area. Didn't realise how poor it was then, but we lived in one of the poorer areas, which was called Hulme, Hulme, and that's where we lived. My mother worked for a time. She worked on the buses. She did a lot of different things, but one of the things that she did during the war years was she worked at Dunlop's, and Dunlop was the very big industrial factor in the war efforts. As you know, they make all kinds of things, but they're most famous for making Dunlop tyres, or in my time, that's what it was. And my mother said that, obviously I'm going on what she told me, she said that part of her job was she used to paint spray what we call the barrage balloons. And barrage balloons used to remind me of baby elephants, and because they were filled with gas, and they were floated high into the sky, tethered by cables, which were in turn tethered to huge blocks of cement anchored in by concrete. And that was meant to make it difficult for bombers coming in and flying in too low over the target, which was Manchester, which was a big industrial town. So she used to spray those. Now, I do remember, I remember the bombing raids. I remember houses that used to be there as a child. I remember that they were no longer there, and I remember vaguely going with my father when we heard the sirens. And to this day, those sirens have a chilling effect on me. They're the kind of thing that companies have been using to signify the start of work and the end of work for their big workforces. So at the end of it, the end of a workday, you would hear the siren go, not during the war years, because they were used to warn people of an impending attack. Now, the forces used to come over, the forces of the Germans, the fleets, squadrons of bombers would come over, and if they weren't taken out, they might make it up to Manchester, and they'd come across the coast and they'd be seen coming across the coast, and that's when we would get the warning that that's probably where they were heading for. And my father was quite deaf, and he didn't, even when he didn't hear the sirens to warn of an air raid, I would wake him, because I would be there and my mother would be working nights at Dunlop's. And so he would then carry me to the air raid shelter. The air raid shelter was a heavily fortified brick and concrete square room that was in the middle of the street. We lived in Tamworth Street in Hume. I don't think it's there anymore. And we used to go there, and all of the neighbours would be in there, and we'd all be squashed in there together, and we would listen to the bombs dropping around us, and we would not know when the all clear came. Same siren would sound again, and we would go out. And obviously, not as a child, I didn't get this, but my father, looking back, would be wondering whether our house would still be standing. I remember playing as a kid in a house that used to be standing and now was no longer standing, and I remember playing in that house before it could be raised. Now what they would do, obviously, they wouldn't just leave a bombed house because it would be dangerous, so they get a bulldozer, and I never was aware of this happening, but it would be flattened and removed as a danger. So the ruined building would be taken down, and the cellars usually filled in, and that would give the kids something to play on, which we would call a debris. I realise now that word is incorrectly pronounced. It should be debris. And they would, that's what would be left. But before that happened, I remember playing in a house that I had known where the people were. And I remember seeing bits of furniture, like a table and, dining room table, with cups on it, still the evidence of a family at a meal. So for parents it must have been an incredible stressful time. My mother told me that when we were huddled in the air raid shelter, they would be quite well taken care of in similar at the factory. And then when the all clear was sounded, they would go back to their benches or their workstation, wherever that was. And the picture she always gave me was of women standing at their workbench, whatever that was. That was the picture that I got. And bearing in mind that there had just been a bombing raid on the city, and that lots of bombs had been dropped, and things had been damaged. I don't know whether this was something that the British used to do, but the Germans were very clever people, and they used to drop what they called incendiary bombs. And incendiary bombs might have very small bombs within them that might not be a whole lot bigger than this, and these would have a highly flammable material in them, so that when they struck and went off, they would create fires. The idea being that the bombers that followed would see fire raging below in the city caused by these incendiary bombs. And something else that they did, which all contributed to the whole panic and fear and terror of being in a bombing raid, was they used to have small bombs which had like a flute, a reed that was in them, and it used to scream as it went down. So every kid knew that if a bomb was being dropped, it would go beep, beep, boom. That was, kids knew that that's what bombs sounded like. In other words, they would issue this screaming noise as they fell, and people below would hear it coming, and they would be wondering whether it was their turn to die. Well, my mother, her description of what it was like at her work was that they would stand by their benches or their workstations, and they would wait for the intercom to click on, and then a voice would come over. She always said it was rather a cold voice would come over and coldly announce the bad news. I suspect that the man who had to do that announcement was struggling to keep his calm and keep the emotion out of his voice, because of what he knew he was telling might mean the death of an entire family, or certainly a home. And what would happen is that he would read the names of the streets that they had heard that were reported as being heavily hit. And when a woman close to my mother, or many women, would hear that their street had been heavily hit, you have to understand what they're actually hearing. They're hearing whether their home is still there. And a lot of women would faint, and then it was my mother never experienced that, fortunately for us, and she and her friends and the colleagues of the woman who had fainted would help, but the woman would walk home alone, and what she would be hurrying home to find out was whether she still had a home, or whether it would be like that little house that was very close to our house in Tamworth Street, which had been bombed and which the family were no longer there. And I never knew as a little kid. I was born just before the outbreak of the war, so by the time the war ended I was 5 years old. So she related that as an incident, and it kind of made me, those kind of memories, looking back, and that chill feeling that I still get with sirens going off. That's what they mean to me. It makes me think that the way that we are being manipulated now about possibility of losing our lives for a very, very slim statistic. We're not being given the right statistics for the corona. And what's happening apparently, and it can be seen because there are whistleblowers, people who come out and tell what they know, and they do it on YouTube, and then somebody sees that. Now, it's going to be taken down, but before it can be taken down, several people will have shared it to some other people. So it spreads, ironically, it spreads like a virus, doesn't it? And they are telling their stories, how doctors and scientists are being fired from their jobs because they refuse to manipulate the statistics. So anybody that's going in is tested not very efficiently for the virus, and then they report that. So now, instead of reporting deaths, we're reporting cases. So many more confirmed cases, as if that's almost like a death, because maybe we're not scared enough because of the percentages of what may or may not happen to you if you get the virus. Apparently it's something like a 90, it's in the 90s for the recovery. So the reason I liken that to my own memories of the war is because people were knowingly risking their lives then for the freedom that they loved and cherished. My father went to enlist, and he volunteered, and we waited for him to come back from being tested, obviously because we would know that we might never see him again if he went away to war, and that was a threat that everyone lived with. Well, when he came back, he had a paper in his hand, and he said, I failed the test because they said I've got tuberculosis. Now, in those days, tuberculosis was a death sentence. They didn't have a cure for it. And he sat with his head in his hands. And of course, as a little kid, I'm just watching, and what do I know, and what can I say? But my mother took the paper from his hand, and she read it herself. And while she's reading it, she said, "You silly bugger! This is not your paper. This is not you. Your name is not on this. They've given you the wrong rejection." So my father took the paper and he ran all the way back to the testing station. But it turned out that he had some other malady. I always knew my father had bronchitis. He was always coughing, terrible smoker, and he wasn't in great health, so they rejected him anyway. So we didn't lose my father to the war, but the willingness to go out and die for the freedom that we were not willing to give up was there. And right now, I'm looking at the freedoms that we're giving up. Businesses are bankrupt. Many businesses. Some of the businesses that we never thought would ever go bankrupt. So there's no income. People are not earning any money. How long the government can go by giving money out, which they're printing, is, well, it can't go on forever, can it? So there's no touching. We're not allowed to hug or touch a friend. We're not allowed to kiss somebody that we love, who we haven't seen for a while. Social distancing. That tends to mean that we don't talk. We don't talk to people because we have masks on. It's difficult to talk to someone when you have a mask. It's difficult to recognize someone sometimes. If they have a baseball cap on, sunglasses and a mask, there's no way you can recognize them. So there's no touching. There's no church. There's no sports stadiums. We're not gathering together to watch a sport that we love. No theatres. We can't go to movies. We can't sit in close proximity. So those things are gone. What else? So movies are gone. Art galleries, schools, all of these things which bring us together as a group of humanity, have been taken away from us. They are our right. What's more, we're not being allowed to say, no, I don't agree. Now, the people that we go to for the information is the media, and they are slanting all of the news so that we will be terrified. Well, I have a feeling that my mother was terrified when she went to work at Dunlop's, when she walked home, when she heard an air raid, when she thought that maybe Tamworth Street, where we lived, had been taken down by bombs. My father, do you think that he didn't have his heart in his mouth when he went to sign up to maybe move to fight the Germans? I'm sure that he did. We all put our lives on the line for the things that we loved. And here we are being imprisoned in our houses and not fighting for the things that we love. Now, the trouble comes when we who would demonstrate peaceably, sanely, and try to talk our way to a freedom of the things we love. It's being messed up by people who are violent demonstrators, looters, criminals, people who are destroying the civilization that we are trying not to lose. So, going to Urbano's funeral made me think about all of these things, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one who has wartime experiences, probably much more traumatic than mine. There are still people out there who fought in wars because it wasn't just the Second World War. There have been other wars. America and possibly Great Britain, though I don't know this about Great Britain, have been fighting a war somewhere, a conflict somewhere, ever since the Second World War, is my understanding. So there's conflict is built in, and yet here we are, we're giving up everything that we love without a fight. We should be making our opinion known. It is we the people. These people who are governing us are working for us, and we should be able to peaceably make our voices heard. This is a foreigner in the Philippines. Got a feeling I'm going to dinner. Bye for now.